He said the panel wasn't working, that's it. That's the whole admission. On lap 38 of the Hungarian Grand Prix, Carlos Sainz collided with Oscar Piastri while the McLaren was lapping him, and it cost Piastri the race. What the broadcast didn't dwell on is what came after. A steward's document, a 5-second penalty instead of the standard 10, and a quiet sentence from Andrea Stella that explains more about how this sport actually works than the collision itself ever could. In this video, you'll understand exactly why a team boss chose to defend the man who took his own driver out of contention, and what that tells you about who the FIA actually protects when a system fails. Here's what happened, stripped of emotion. Piastri led from lap 1 after a clean opening move through turns 1 and 2. He built and defended that lead through 2 pit stops. On lap 38, approaching turn 3, he arrived to lap Sainz, who was mid-battle with Fernando Alonso for a midfield position that meant nothing to McLaren's afternoon and everything to Williams's. Sainz didn't see him. Contact followed. Piastri lost the seconds that mattered. Lando Norris, running in clean air with nobody left to lap, inherited the race. Piastri retired several laps later with a broken gearbox, running second. Sainz received a penalty, 5 seconds, not 10. And that number is where this story actually begins. Before you get the rest of this, subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from, because the way this penalty was justified reads completely differently, depending on whether you've ever trusted a stewards panel to begin with. Now, who is telling you this story matters? This isn't a rival pundit speculating on a podcast. This isn't a fan account guessing at motive. This is the team principal of the team that lost the race, speaking to Sky Sports F1 with a microphone in his face, hours after the checkered flag. Andrea Stella didn't blame Sainz. He didn't even ask for a stronger penalty. What he said was this: "My understanding is that the blue panels were not working, so perhaps today was more difficult than normal for the backmarkers to appreciate what was happening in their mirrors." Read that again. The man whose driver lost the win is telling you the system failed, not the driver. So let's put this under real pressure. Did Sainz know Piastri was there? According to the steward's own findings, no. He was in what drivers call a blind spot, coming out of a fight with Alonso. Was he warned? Yes, his engineer told him blue flags were out. Did he see the flag itself? The panel system, by the FIA's own account, wasn't displaying properly that day. Was this negligence? Or was this a driver doing exactly what the available information allowed him to do? That is not a rhetorical question. It's the one the stewards spent an entire document answering, and it's worth naming that document by its number because almost nobody in this sport does. FIA Document 54 states plainly that the stewards examined video, telemetry, team radio, and in-car camera evidence before concluding that Sainz was, in their words, wholly responsible for the collision. Wholly responsible. And yet the standard 10-second penalty for causing a collision was cut in half? Under a strict reading, wholly responsible for a race-deciding collision gets you the standard punishment. That's the baseline every driver on the grid operates under. In Hungary, the stewards looked at the exact same facts: full responsibility, confirmed contact, a compromised leader, and decided the standard didn't apply because Sainz couldn't see the car he hit. On its own, that's a defensible piece of reasoning. Visibility genuinely matters in wheel-to-wheel racing. But hold that decision next to every other 5-second versus 10-second call this stewards panel has made this season, and ask yourself honestly, is "he didn't see him" a standard that gets applied evenly, or is it a standard that gets found exactly when it's convenient to find it? Neither ruling alone is indefensible. Put them side by side, and nobody can tell you what the actual bar is anymore. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of story you'll want to be here for the next time a stewards panel reaches for a number that doesn't add up. So picture the alternative. What was Sainz actually supposed to do? Mid-battle with Alonso, with a broken blue light system on his steering wheel and no clear panel signal? Pull off the racing line on the assumption that someone might be arriving? Abandon his own fight for a position that meant survival for his season? On a hunch? There wasn't a clean option here. That's the uncomfortable part of this story, that a 10-second penalty pretends doesn't exist. Now, the number. 5 seconds sounds almost like a rounding error. It is not. Piastri served those lost seconds behind a car he had every right to be passed already, at exactly the moment Lewis Hamilton's fresher tires were closing in behind him at the second stops. McLaren's decision to prioritize Piastri at that stop worked. He rejoined still ahead of Hamilton. But the time he lost to Sainz is the time Norris used to build what Stella himself confirmed was roughly half a second per lap in clean air. Half a second, compounding lap after lap, is not a footnote. It is the entire margin that turned a McLaren 1-2 into a Piastri retirement and a Norris win. Take the blue flag failure out of the equation, and the maths of that afternoon change completely. Here's a detail worth sitting with, situated properly in time. Months ago at the United States Grand Prix, this same Andrea Stella stood in front of the same broadcaster and called a steward's decision inappropriate. A penalty that cost Norris a position after a wheel-to-wheel battle with Max Verstappen. Back then, Stella argued the stewards had no business interfering with what he called a beautiful piece of motorsport. In Hungary, facing a penalty that actually helped explain away a collision that hurt his own team, he didn't reach for that word once. He reached for measured language about a broken panel instead. Keep that contrast in mind, because it comes back every time this stewards panel makes a call that isn't perfectly clean. Zoom out from this single Sunday, and you start to see the actual system. A blue flag panel network that's supposed to be simple, lit or not lit, apparently failed during a live Grand Prix, and nobody has fully explained why that failure wasn't caught before lights out. Stewards then built a mitigating circumstance around that failure, one that reduced a penalty for a driver who, by their own words, was wholly responsible. That's not a conspiracy. It's something more mundane and, in some ways, more troubling. A governing body patching a hardware failure with a leniency clause after the fact, race-changing consequences and all. Now, the honest counter-argument, because it deserves airtime. Sainz genuinely could not see Piastri. The team radio confirms his focus was locked onto Alonso. If the light system had worked as intended, this entire story doesn't exist. That is a real defensible mitigating factor, and it's the reason the stewards didn't throw the book at him. That's a fair position. It is also not the one that survives being placed next to every other penalty call this stewards panel has issued this season without that kind of leniency attached. What comes next is the part nobody in the paddock wanted written down in a press release. Before I give it to you, subscribe, because this exact story, a hardware failure quietly reshaping a race result, is going to happen again this season. And you'll want the file already open when it does. So here's the verdict. This wasn't sabotage. Nobody engineered Piastri's loss on purpose. But a broken piece of infrastructure was allowed to decide a Grand Prix, and the institution responsible for that infrastructure responded by softening the punishment for the driver caught inside the failure, rather than fully reckoning with the failure itself. Would the stewards have found the same mitigating circumstance if the collision had cost a midfield also ran instead of derailing the championship's most informed driver? I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I do. It's not proven. It is simply a question anyone watching that race is entitled to ask out loud. The championship doesn't pause to explain itself. Piastri now sits 7th with 92 points, a season that keeps handing him mechanical failures and now a documented systems failure, while Kimi Antonelli leads with 219. The sport resumes after the summer break at the Dutch Grand Prix, and you can be certain of one thing. Every steward in that paddock will be watching their own blue flag panels a great deal more closely. Whether that means this exact failure never happens again, or whether it just gets explained away more quietly next time, is the question this whole story is actually about. So tell me, is he didn't see him a real mitigating factor? Or is it the exact kind of excuse a stewards panel reaches for when it doesn't want to hand out the full penalty? Vote in the comments, and while you're there, tell me if you remember Stella calling that Austin penalty inappropriate, because a few of you brought that clip up under the last video, and it's exactly the contradiction this one is built on. This story isn't over. When the FIA responds to the criticism of the panel failure itself, and they will have to, you'll want to be here for it. Hit like, leave your verdict, and until the next one.